I'm not sure. So let me check if we're online now. Not yet, I think. Okay, we are online finally.
All right.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this second episode of 2 weeks of databases. Oh, but I should mute myself, sorry. Okay, sorry for the echo. So today there will be a hopefully great interview to great members of the DexterityDB team. And first of all, what is DexterityDB? Well, it is a young technology, which is basically a storage engine that you can plug into some other technologies. More on this later. And it's designed for real-time analytics. I got to know the project some time ago, and I had the pleasure to try a very early version, probably 1 year ago. Well, of course, as expected, it was not mature yet, but again, it wasn't supposed to be. I was really surprised by the good performance of certain queries. We will mention this later. So let's start. Let's start by having our hosts introducing themselves. Dillon, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'm Dillon Uzar. I'm the current CEO of DexterityDB. I also manage the technical architecture of the product.
And I'm Alex Sabella, also co-founder of DexterityDB, and I do some of the tech and a lot of other things. We kind of jump around from thing to thing all the time.
Great. So if people didn't know about Dexterity, they listened to my very, very brief introduction, and probably they're wondering, first of all, where it can be plugged into. So your website mentions actually MySQL and MongoDB, and of course MariaDB. It also mentioned that other technologies may come in the future. Is that the case?
Yes. Actually, we're probably going to have Postgres and probably a couple of others before Mongo. We're having Mongo has a relatively new plugin architecture, so it's a little bit difficult for us to figure out everything on how to plug in, but we will be doing that plus Postgres. But Postgres we found is a lot easier, so that might actually come sooner.
Great. A couple of others. You're
Yes.
planning to plug basically everywhere.
Yes, we actually plan on plugging in practically everywhere, just like how RocksDB is.
Great.
So we anticipate eventually opening up, after we get some of these initial integrations done, opening up what we've done, so then we can work with others to integrate our engine into other products.
Okay, that's great. Do you want to talk us about the intended use cases of Dexterity?
Yeah, so Dexterity is about speeding up analytics. It's for real-time analytics, as Federico mentioned. And the point of it is to plug into traditional databases like MySQL, Maria, Percona, Variants, and Postgres, and others. And it's meant to supplement their default engines with a analytical solution. So the whole point of our product is to work with your existing infrastructure. You don't have to replace anything. You can continue to use the same queries that you need. If you're finding that your current system is slowing down because you're using a lot more analytics now than you did in the past, our product is perfect. You just plug it right in. You get to use the same query interface. Nothing changes. You don't need to change your infrastructure. You get to use the same tools. That's the point of the product.
And I think it's a very good idea. I mean, often teams are overloaded with work also because they have too many tools to manage. Of course, I'm thinking especially to DevOps teams. I have a curiosity. Probably also other people have the same curiosity. What does your name mean?
So we actually, surprising enough, we actually took inspiration from like Dungeons and Dragons in a sense. So dexterity is like agility and such. So for that, it's since we're an analytical solution, we're meant to speed up your analytics. We end up just using dexterity in there for that. We joked around in the past about making other variants that were for the other types of stats, but for right now, like dexterity is actually our product, and that's where we got the inspiration for the name for.
Great. Yeah, probably Dungeons and Dragons is the way non-native English speakers learned what dexterity is.
Yeah, I think
Yep.
it's also that we picked dexterity just because we try not to do anything that's like fancy caching or any shortcuts. Our tool is meant to be ad hoc and truly speed up performance. So that goes to the agility that Dillon was talking to, and in being able to do whatever you want to do and not necessarily have to prepare things ahead of time.
That's a very good thing. Well, probably depends on the use cases, but yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so do you want to maybe give us an overview of how DexterityDB works?
Yeah. So since it does plug into other databases, it is a plugin. And essentially what happens when we plug in, we actually replace how the database stores and processes information. So a normal storage engine will just be a storage layer. We actually break down databases into 3 different types. One is the user level or the API level, where you'd end up querying from. You have the computational layer, which ends up processing all the data, and then you have a storage layer. So our product actually replaces both the computational and storage layers of a database. And how it works is when a query comes in, generally the database will end up processing the query and provide us with a tree that would end up giving us what we need to do. And we'd negotiate with the database on what things we can handle and what things we're going to let the database handle after we give them the results. After that negotiation process is done, then we go ahead and we push it down into our engine, and we grab any related data that we can identify, process it, and throw it back. And how that works is our engine is rather similar to a traditional row storage engine. However, it has some columnar characteristics. So we do store whole row into a row store. That's so we can easily retrieve the data back into the regular format that MySQL and others are used to. But our indexes actually utilize various forms of compression. We actually have a specialized type of tree that we developed that allows us to store relevant information in place and statistics about every key to be able to speed up the analytics portion. And what we do is, as we're going through in our indexes, they can, when we're performing an aggregate, we actually don't have to pull every single row of information, fetch it from the raw storage, and then process and pull out the information and then throw it into the aggregate. We instead can go down into the index, utilize some very small pieces of stats that we store, and we can then use that to bypass having to end up grabbing all of the raw storage. And we can actually group data points together in one point of the tree. Like if we're going through a range of 2 pieces in the index, we can actually grab statistics in the middle of the tree that is already sort of pre-computed based off of inherent characteristics of our tree, and utilize that to speed up the aggregates. And that allows us, say, if there's 10 billion rows that a range would be in, we might only have to look at 10,000 data points to be able to compute the aggregate. So it drastically speeds up the performance as a result. For other pieces, I think that's generally about it. We do some compression and reorganization of data. Like how we end up doing our row storage, it is append based. So whenever you insert a new row, it ends up adding it to the end, but it's not temporal in the sense that it stores the old one. We actually mark that for collection later on. And periodically, whenever we have some idle time, we'll go back and collect that. Or if we notice that there's enough block space and somebody's trying to insert something in, we might end up doing some reorganization during that operation to end up saving some space. So there's a lot of background processes that end up trying to compact all the information. And we try to, whenever you're running a query, if you're running a lot of queries at once and it's taking up most of the CPU, we'll actually delay some of that compaction process and actually just mark everything to be append. So it actually just throws it to the end of the file. We'll end up updating some of our indexes. How it ends up storing some of those updates in the index is it is like appending in a sense, how we end up storing our trees. So during the process of inserting or updating, you actually get rather quick write performance because we are append, but we'll go back and then reorganize everything so they're not as fragmented. So when you come back and do aggregates, then it's rather quick.
Yeah, very interesting. You anticipated some things that I wanted to ask later. Yeah, especially the indexes and the speed of aggregate queries. I'm very curious because, you know, from your explanation of indexes, I'm not totally sure, are these indexes also usable, or if they are usable, are they also efficient for point queries? I mean, queries that retrieve one specific row.
So there is a couple of pieces to that that are important to keep in mind. We actually don't have the sense of a primary key in our engine. We actually have an internal primary key. We use basically an ID system to end up looking up everything. So when you're doing a point lookup, depending on how that's done, if it's just a normal user ending one where you're just doing a select and you're trying to grab from like a primary key or a unique key, it'll go to that index and then it will go ahead and resolve to the end of the tree and pull that out. So in terms of point lookups, it can be a little bit slower from a traditional engine, but that's not necessarily our focus. Our focus is more on aggregates. But one thing to keep in mind, if there are, we do some compression in our indexes where we can actually skip some of the layers and we group a lot of things together. It still behaves like a log n type of system. However, the n is the number of unique keys to look up. So if you are using unique or primary key, you're still going to have the performance hit of having to go through an index. However, if you're trying to use it for aggregates, the grouping actually helps quite a lot if you are looking at multiple keys at once.
Okay. Okay, I'm not necessarily saying that it is important for your use case, but just to understand, do you support unique keys and foreign keys?
Yeah, so we support unique keys. In terms of foreign keys, actually, the databases we plug into handle a lot of that because we only care about the table level, at least how we end up integrating into these databases. So the databases will actually hand it to us as a unique key, and then they will perform all of the cross lookups for the primary to end up doing all the checks to make sure that they exist.
In the case of MySQL and MariaDB, I'm afraid that the database doesn't take care of foreign keys. Currently, they are implemented in the storage engine.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
But, yeah.
It's a little weird because their API is since it is basically thrown over the course of like a couple of decades, making the API for MySQL and Maria, Some pieces do appear to be handled by the database itself. We do go ahead and so when for MySQL and Maria, when they end up handing us a query, they're only going to give it to us based off of the current table that it's trying to access. So we only get table context. So for that, we can't go ahead and look up to another table to go ahead and verify that all the checks are in there. Some of those checks actually will be performed by the piece right above. So we do mark that our engine does support primary keys, and that actually causes, at least in our tests, MySQL and Maria to perform some cross lookups.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. We have a question from DB Demon, which asks us, how complicated is it to install for MySQL or MariaDB?
Yeah, so all what you need is you just need to download our plugin. We'll actually be adding it onto our website. We were just talking to Federico about this a little bit ago. We'll be adding a way for you to be able to download and just install it in the next week or two. And you just download it, you put it into the plugin folder for MySQL or MariaDB. We'll actually have instructions on where those are located depending on the OS you're on. And then you just run one command in MySQL or MariaDB, and it'll recognize that plugin. And then you can alter your tables to end up using our engine. So it's just a single alter command, and you just specify the engine type, and it'll just migrate everything over. So it's a rather simple process to get it plugged in. It should only take about 3 minutes. And then whatever time it takes to migrate that data over to our engine. Okay,
so I suppose that it will be more or less as easy with MongoDB?
Yes, it's a similar process. Slightly different, but similar.
Okay, yeah. If I remember correctly, MongoDB only allows to use one storage engine, right?
I believe so. I haven't used Mongo in a couple of months. We've been focused a lot on MySQL and Maria over the last couple of months, but I believe it's only one engine at a time. I'll have to check that again. We only just recently started getting Mongo, at least the integration started. So one thing I just want to make clear, we only have it available for MySQL and Maria right now. In the
It also works for
Postgres
Percona.
Mongo.
Just throwing that in there. It also works with Percona just because
any Percona variants.
But
yeah, sorry for not mentioning it. Of course, I mean, generally what works on MySQL will work on Percona as well. So yeah, we will have an interview with someone from MongoDB this Friday, so we can ask a confirmation about the storage engine limitation. Okay, I see another question. How will DexterityDB integrate with the future of computing, aka photonic computing? I don't know if it's a question that you can answer or not.
I don't know about how we can end up integrating in the future for photonic computing. So photonic computing, I'm assuming for like computers that are using light rather than electronics, I'm assuming is the question.
I assuming the same, but if someone wants to answer here.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on how the hardware architecture would work with the software. Since we're a software solution, it would depend on how that hardware works with current operating systems, or if there's new ones, how we would end up basically compiling against those.
Okay. We have also a question from Justin Swanart that asks us if there are benchmarks. Public benchmark results.
Alex, do we have some benchmark results on the site right now?
We don't currently have any public benchmark results. I'm sorry, I have landscapers all of a sudden decided to start. We don't have public benchmarks on the site right now, but we do have private ones that will be public soon. And if anybody has any specific things that they do want to see, we are always looking for new things to test, just because there's so many use cases that, you know, we want to try to show it off in as many capacities as possible, but we can't always come up with every single example.
Yeah, just for an example, one of the ones that we commonly point to is TPCH benchmark. For that one, depending on the type of query, when we plug in, we can be between 3 times to 20 times faster than the built-in engine without making any changes to how it might be stored. There's
Dillon,
a couple that... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you could also talk to the taxi benchmark that we did a while back. I think that was actually the version that Federico had tried out.
Yeah. So for that one, so for the taxi benchmark, it's taking all the New York City taxi information for like the last decade and then aggregating it into the storage engine. I think it's 1.5 billion data points.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, we actually found that we are up to 300 times quicker for that version that we gave you, Federico. Obviously, it depends. We actually find that the more data that you put in, the quicker that we can actually become, because we end up basically how our tree works, our indexes, since we have inherent stats at any layer of the tree, the more that you keep on inserting and the tree grows, the quicker we're able to speed up analytics, because we only have to look across the range in the tree. And as there's more levels added, there's more ways for us to skip rows of information. So the larger the data set, the quicker it is. So for the TPCH benchmark, that's only 1 to 10 gigs of data that we commonly just test against. But for like the taxi benchmark, that's several tens of gigs of data. And for that, we actually see 300 times quicker. And for some of the information that we store right now, like we're still improving how we integrate with MySQL Maria and pushing down more of the computation down to our end. So we anticipate that to get quicker as we start to handle more types of aggregate functions.
And we find that a really important metric for benchmarking our software because, you know, as we mentioned, we are planning to try to get many different integrations or into, you know, the most popular places. And at each one, there's a slightly different performance, just what Dillon had mentioned about the way that we actually integrate into the platform. So one of the important metrics that we still look at is, you know, what is our raw performance outside of the platform, and then how we can bring that cap into the actual platform and try to speed up that, you know, specific database.
Okay.
Yeah, for that, just to add to Alex's comment, for TPCH outside of plugged-in database, we do see about 100 times improvement to TPCH. So we're looking to constantly keep on pushing down more computation to our engine to speed it up.
Okay, that's great to hear. If at some point you have benchmark to publish, it will be interesting if they are reproducible, so one can just try probably something similar to his own use case. And yeah, but yeah, it's of course interesting numbers we're hearing. Justin also asked, I guess in response to what you were saying, I may have missed it, but I assume this is columnar.
So it's actually sort of a hybrid of a row store and columnar. So whenever you're having indexes, it's going to behave for those just columnar, but we just store basic row information. Like, so we have a use case where you might have a lot of data that you don't necessarily need to aggregate on. It's just appended data that you might need to fetch later. So we still behave as a row based. But whenever you're dealing with the aggregate portions, the indexes are supposed to behave columnar based. So it is a trade-off of storage. We will be a little bit more storage than a pure columnar engine, but by having that type of hybrid setup, we can still support like other data that you might not need to have in that type of setup where you just need to quickly fetch information at a row-based level.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Okay, well, Justin also asked question about a more complex case, asking if your indexes can handle it, but it's a bit complicated now to read the SQL condition. And no, I mean, it would be very interesting, but maybe it would get a bit hard to follow. But maybe we can do some kind of how to call it, some kind of question and answer in written form later, just to complement in case, some follow-up, exactly as Justin is writing. Some follow-up
we could take
in
any of
written
those
form that
questions
we can do
offline.
later, just to,
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. Another thing I'd like to ask is what you did until now open source, and if not, why, and if yes, why?
So that's an interesting question, because right now everything that we've done is not open source. We use private repos for right now. The main reason behind that is we were constantly iterating, and we wanted to focus on working with specific enterprise customers first to make sure that they can fit into generic analytic use cases. And we weren't too focused on trying to get an open source community around it. We have flopped in the past between going ahead and trying to start open sourcing and trying to start a community around that. However, we've constantly just come back and forth since we're a rather small team. We've been mostly focusing on specific customer use cases, and we haven't really been focusing too much on trying to bring any collaboration outside or for people to necessarily just look through our code. There's also a second reason, which is we were in the middle of the process of patenting our technology. And just based off of our lawyer's recommendation, they wanted us to just keep the source closed while they were going through the process. That's now completed. So we're looking to now open source pieces of our code over time, since it's split up into a bunch of different repos.
Yeah, we're planning on trying to open source at least all the plugin codes, like the integration codes, really, between our engine and the various platforms. We do think that's probably one of the most valuable pieces that will be useful for contributors as well, just because if somebody wants to use it in some other database that we may not be focusing on, we'd like to have the help of the community and also help them by just allowing it to be like more of an open API to allow you to plug it into other things. I think RocksDB had something similar. Their core is open source, but they also allow people to kind of make community integrations to the various databases, which definitely expands the reach for sure.
Yeah, communities are always a great thing. So just to clarify, so if I understand correctly, some parts of the way Dexterity functions is covered by patents.
Yes, and that is for our ability. This is getting more into like startups. For our ability, at least in the New York area, to end up getting investment, since investors like to see that you own the IP, and it just helps us to cover our technology, to recognize that we have ownership over what we end up designing, and that way we can just try to make sure that what we developed is going to be ours as we just build it out and create the company.
Yeah, no, what you're saying is surely interesting. One thing that is particularly interesting, I think, is the part about investors, because probably a lot of people had ideas of tools to develop, and the reason why many times one doesn't even start is because money is needed, and simply many of us don't know how to properly look for fundings. And yeah, it's interesting, and in my opinion, not positive that investors give so much importance to patents, because I think there is a very simple fact that people should consider. If you develop something, yeah, you can explain me how it works. I can try to make some other software that uses the same principles, but hardly it will be as good as yours, because you know the idea better than I.
Right.
Experience is not something that is very easy to transfer.
Yeah,
or
we found that it's very different depending on the area that you're in. Like, for example, the West Coast investors actually like the idea of having open source projects if you're a software company. For the New York East Coast area of United States, we've found when talking with a bunch of investors, they want to see IP, which is actually interesting because they don't necessarily care about what your IP covers. They want to see that you actually just have IP somewhere in your product. And that's what we've sort of noticed. And just to keep us open to both sides, we've sort of tried to at least patent our technology. So then we have that in there. And one of the things that I want to add to your point, Federico, is it's basically not only just our idea and we know better, but we've also developed it over a period of time. So it requires a lot of time for people to try to catch up with whatever you developed. So we went through the man hours of building it, things like that. So it's very interesting. I agree with you that investors focus so much on patents.
And it's not so much patenting, any like the code specifically. It's more about what we did was we took, those data structures that Dillon was talking about that we had never really come across, they're very custom and hybrid, and that's really what we focused on, was more of like the idea and less of the actual implementation. And so we don't really have any secrecy or desire to keep private anything of how we integrate into other databases or even necessarily how our code functions. It's more to do with just the underlying structures and certain algorithms.
There is another question from Justin. Actually, it sounds more as an objection, but it's interesting. I myself, I don't know the answer, but basically he asks, so your interpretation of GPL is that it is okay for a plugin to link to a proprietary library. It sounds like you will open the plugin source, but it will link to closed source, right? This is what he asks. I have no idea what the correct answer is.
Yeah, for the immediate future, we'll be opening how our integration into these open source databases. So we'll be opening the C side and part of our Rust side that is used for like the API interface, at least for the immediate future. In probably sometime in the near future, we'll end up open sourcing everything eventually. Okay. But right now, we're actually going through the process of cleaning up our repos, making sure that there's some documentation, and we're trying to split out some pieces that we do want to keep private. Like, for example, some enterprise licensing side, we want to try to go ahead and just keep private, while just everything that's focused on like how we're integrating and how we work with those databases, we're going to open source so then everybody is aware of how that works. And then we'll also be eventually open sourcing our core as we move forward and grow to allow everybody to see how it ends up working, possibly go ahead and make some variations or go off and make their own integrations into other databases.
So correct me if I'm mistaken. My interpretation is just-in stopped is valid, but in any case, everything will be open sourced at some point.
Well, it's my understanding that GPL requires that if you're using another library or link inside of your code, then it requires you to also make it GPL.
Okay.
So I think that we've basically built everything from scratch as far as our core code.
Okay.
The plugin is fitting into MariaDB and MySQL, but we don't reference anything specifically in our core code that is coming from MariaDB or MySQL code. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay.
But just to
okay.
hit on the GPL thing specifically.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I don't know if it is. I mean, I think that in some cases it's very complicated to find out if something is completely compliant with a license or not, and this is probably one of those cases. But anyway.
We do take care to try to use stuff that is either MIT or we tend to shy away from anything that we've had this conversation before. So we tend to look deeply into what it what requires what. So I think that we're okay for now, but I mean, I guess we could be wrong.
Yeah. I mean,
it's
probably
a very complex issue.
Probably
like
none of us is a lawyer, so.
True.
Another question is about your, let's say, adoption strategy. I mean, okay, I understand that for sure the product will be downloadable, but do you also plan to have maybe a cloud offer?
Yeah, we do plan on having some setups where you can basically run it in the cloud. One of the problems around that is, of course, because we're a plugin for some of these databases, we need to get the rights to be able to create cloud images that might be MySQL or Maria or Mongo. So that's just something that we have to work with those companies for. And that's the only restriction there on us trying to easily create cloud images for that. But we do plan on having ways to just quickly spin up a DexterityDB enabled database in the cloud in the future. It does work right now with any database that you do have, obviously within restriction, like for example, Amazon RDS, they limit what type of plugins that you can use. It's whatever they come packaged with it. But if you have your own instance, you can go ahead and just plug our plugin within that. Okay,
great. Just as a follow-up for the previous discussion, we have a comment from Morgan Tucker. Morgan will be interviewed in some days, also, tomorrow actually. Yeah, will be interviewed tomorrow. In one of his past jobs, he worked for Oracle, and he wrote one of Oracle's MySQL pledges when acquiring Sun was a non-assertion to storage engine plugins. It is okay to be proprietary. So it seems you don't have anything to fear in this case.
Well, thank you for that.
Okay, no, thanks for Morgan. I love this kind of interaction because, I mean, the crowd the audience may always have some useful information to add. Because both the interviewed people and, of course, I don't know everything. So, okay, so I think that we talked about everything, and I think it was a great interview. There is only one thing that I want to ask you more. It is something that I'm asking to all the guests. Basically, we are living in sad times, and there are some small positive aspects. One of them is that people have much more time to read. So do you have 2 books each to suggest? One database related book if possible, and one book on any other topic, technical or not. Basically, whoever wants to start is okay.
Dylan,
Yeah.
do you know what you're going to say yet?
I would have to think about something that is database related. I'm not great at remembering names. I've read a lot, probably more academic papers than anything in terms of books. There's probably just a few that I read, but I can't remember any of the names. In terms of another book that's unrelated to databases, I guess I would recommend Name of the Wind. It's a great fantasy novel by a guy named Patrick Ruffus. It's a series of in the Kingkiller Chronicles. I think that it's great. But in terms of something database related, I can't recall anything off the top of my head.
I would say
that's fine.
I would say
That's
that yeah. So I don't know if anybody is trying to create something new or start any kind of company or anything. I think that this is kind of a great time to explore your own idea, just because you have a lot of time on your hands where you're not necessarily in an office or in that kind of setting. So it's a great time to either read books about entrepreneurship. I mean, there's some great ones out there like the Lean Startup, the obvious ones, but I think besides just the technical aspect, it's a great time to just kind of explore your own idea and see if you can come up with something that fits into something that already exists or goes out on its own. As far as personal books, I'm reading. Well, I didn't start it yet, but I'm looking into. I think it's called Sandstorm. I think it's James Rollins. It's kind of like an Indiana Jones type feel, but that's on a personal level. But yeah, so I would just say, go for it. Use this time to improve on anything that you felt like you didn't have time for, and that's kind of what I'm doing. And I think Dylan too is just kind of take some time and be like, you know what, we can still do a lot remotely. It doesn't have to necessarily cripple us. So
yeah. I like your answer very much. Let's say to everyone who's listening, don't spend all your time in social networks. You can do much better things.
Except
I mean, I'm
YouTube
not
watching
saying
us,
leave
right?
Facebook, remain on Facebook, but still read something useful, because in other periods of your life, maybe you will not have the time to do it.
Right.
Okay, so I really enjoyed this interview, both the technical aspects, but also everything we covered. As usual, we remain with big doubts about what is allowed or not allowed with licenses. I invite people to well, if they're interested, of course, I invite them to learn more about DexterityDB. Do you want to suggest some place to start, just for new people?
Yeah, so they can go onto our website. We're adding more information over the next few weeks. This year is definitely our first public launch. We've only been around for about 2 years, focusing on plugging into MySQL and Maria.
Okay.
So last year was mostly just doing private betas with various companies to verify that everything works on a large scale. And this year we're hoping to just expand it so anybody can go ahead and try it, and just adding more content. So going onto our website, you can contact us on there as well. We're responsive. We'll go ahead and answer any questions you have. And just over the next few weeks, we'll be adding more ways to find out more about us and to read more about how it all works on there.
Okay, that's great. So our time is over. So the initiative 2 weeks of databases will continue tomorrow with an interview to Morgan Tucker, which works for PlanetScale. And the interview can be watched again on YouTube. And until next time, bye to everyone. Stay safe and stay brilliant.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.